Hi there, everyone. My name is John, and I'm a practicum student at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, studying wildlife education. And just now I got done putting my chickens in the coop for a little bit to keep them safe. Now I want you to think to yourself for a moment, what would I be keeping my chickens safe from? If you thought of anything around the lines of foxes, weasels, or some other predators, you'd be right. But today, we're just going to focus on 3 different critters. And those critters are the red fox, weasels, and red-tailed hawks. So why do these 3 critters like chickens so much? And what can we do to keep chickens and our critters safe? That's what we're going to find out today. But before we dive into that, I think it'd be a really great idea to explore each of our 3 critters' life histories. Our first critter is the red fox. As you're looking at the red fox, try and point out different characteristics or appearances that you think might benefit the fox out in the wild. One thing that I noticed is that it has orangish color. That orangish color can be used as camouflage when they're in tall grass or in a leaf-littered area. Now, red foxes can be found almost everywhere in the northern hemisphere, from North America, Europe, to Asia, as you can see in this range map. Red foxes are omnivores just like most of us people. They will eat plants and meat. When it comes to their reproductive life, they will have from 2 to 12 babies. As you enjoy this picture of these 2 baby foxes, try and guess what a baby fox is called. You might have guessed anything around the lines of pups or puppies because they are in the canine family. However, they're actually called kits. Next up are our weasels. Notice I said weasels as in plural. There are 3 weasels found in North America, and all 3 can be found in Wisconsin. Those 3 species are the long-tailed weasel. Our 3 weasel species all look very similar, but if you look at specific characteristics, you'll be able to notice some differences between them. First here is the long-tailed weasel. What do you first notice about the long-tailed weasel? You might notice that it has a brown upper body and white underside. But then also, you can use their name as a hint. They have a long tail compared to their body size. This first range map represents the long-tailed weasel's range. Now, all 3 weasels' ranges vary a little bit. In this first range, as you can see, the long-tailed weasel can be found almost all throughout the United States, including the southern portion of Canada, down into Mexico, and even South America. As you look at the next few ranges of the other weasels, try and compare the differences in their ranges, and also think to yourself as to why their ranges are limited to certain areas. The short-tailed weasel. Here's an image of a short-tailed weasel. You might notice that it looks very similar to the long-tailed weasel. However, short-tailed weasels are actually a little bit smaller than the long-tails. What do you first notice about the short-tailed weasel? Once again, it has a brown upper body and then a white underside, but its tail is shorter. Now let's look at the short-tailed weasel home range. Notice how different it is compared to the long-tailed weasel, as the short-tailed weasels are found in more of the northern hemisphere. They can be found in Wisconsin, Minnesota, along with parts of the Northeast and Northwest. But they do not go all the way down south like the long-tailed weasels do. And the least weasel, which is the smallest one. Now you're looking at a least weasel. What do you first notice about the least weasel? You might notice how short its tail is compared to our two previous weasels that we talked about. You also might notice that the least weasel does not have a black tipped tail like our other two species do. Once again, take time to observe the distribution of the least weasel. You might notice that it actually looks pretty similar to one of our other weasels that we already looked at. What weasel has a very similar looking distribution of the least weasel? If you picked the short-tailed weasel, you'd be right. Both the short-tailed and least weasels live more in the northern hemisphere, compared to the long-tailed weasel that can be found all the way down into South America. Now let's look at all three of our weasels together, just to make sure that we can tell the difference between them. So for starters, I'm going to have you find one thing different between the short-tailed weasel and the least weasel. You might have noticed that the least weasel has a very short tail and no black tip to it. And the short-tailed weasel having a slightly longer tail with a black tip. Now, what's one thing that's similar between them? Feel free to look at the writing notes on the left side. You might have noticed that they both say white feet. Both the least weasel and short-tailed weasel have white paws. Now, I want you to find one thing different between the short-tailed weasel and long-tailed weasel. Once again, feel free to look at the notes on the left side. You might have noticed, for starters, that the long-tailed weasel has a much longer tail. But they also have brown paws. The short-tailed weasel, as you remember, they have white paws. Weasels are the smallest land carnivore in North America, and they're really successful animals when it comes to hunting. And then lastly, when it comes to their reproductive life, they can have from 1 to 12 babies. Here's an image of some baby weasels. Do you want to take a guess what a baby weasel's called? You might have had a variety of guesses for this one, but it's actually very similar to the fox. Baby weasels are also called kits. And then lastly, we have our red-tailed hawks. Red-tailed hawks are a beautiful animal. What are some characteristics that you first notice about this bird? One of your first notices might be where it gets its name from. They have a very bright cinnamon red tail. You also might have noticed their beak. They have a very sharp beak in which they use to prey on animals and feed. And then lastly, of course, if you've ever heard the phrase eyes like a hawk, they have very great eyesight, much better than humans. Red-tailed hawks can be found all throughout North America, from Alaska all the way down to Central America, as you can see in this picture. As you look at the hawk range map, you notice two different colors, blue and red. Blue represents where the hawks will spend their time year-round. Red represents where they'll only breed there. Why might the hawks only breed in the northern region and not spend their time year-round? Well, if you thought anything around the lines of cold and winter, you're right. Hawks up in Alaska and Canada, they cannot handle those harsh winters, so they'll actually migrate down into the warmer United States. Now, red-tailed hawks are just like the weasels. They're strictly carnivores, so they also just eat meat. When it comes to their reproductive life, they can have from 1 to 5 babies. In this image, you can see a parent feeding 2 baby hawks. I'm going to take a moment and have you guess what a baby hawk is called. I'll give you a hint, it's also the same as chickens. Baby hawks are called chicks. Now that we know the general information of our three critters, it's time to dive into each of their critter-chicken relationships. Let's go. So why do our three critters, the fox, weasel, and hawk, see chickens as 10-piece McNuggets? Well, chickens are not only just an easy food source for us people, but also for other animals. And chickens, believe it or not, they're not the best flyers and they can't run that fast. So it makes it really tempting for our three critters to take a bite. Now it's time for a little activity and take a peck into each of our three critters' food chains. Food chains represent how energy flows within an ecosystem, big or small. So let's get started. First is the red fox. Sorry, I don't know what that was about. But anywho, here's an image of a red fox food chain. Take time to observe all the animals in the chain. And while you're looking at that food chain, try and find what animal that the chicken could substitute for. While studying the red fox food chain, what animal did you think could be the best fit for the chicken to substitute for? He has his answer. The answer is ruffed grouse. Now, let's look at our next critter. The next food chain I want you to look at is the food chain of the weasel. Take time to study the weasel's food chain and see which animal that the chicken could substitute for. So while you're studying the weasel food chain, what animal do you think the chicken could best substitute for? If you picked the bobwhite quail, you'd be right again. While we look at our last food chain, I want you to once again think of which animal the chicken could substitute for. Our last food chain that we'll be looking at is from the red-tailed hawk. Once again, take time to observe all the animals in that food chain. And of course, think which animal the chicken could substitute for. So what animal could the chicken substitute for in the hawk food chain? If you picked the ringneck pheasant, you're right on the money. And now for this last little activity, I'm going to have you all create your own food chain. So I want you to take time and think about what animals or plants would be in your food chain. And of course, include you in it. It can be really elaborate or simple. Here's an image of a food chain just so you can look at it. And feel free to pause just so you can take more time to make your food chain. While you're looking at all three of our food chains between the fox, weasel, and hawk, was there any kind of trend that you noticed between all three of them? You might have noticed that all three food chains had at least one wild bird in it that kind of looks like a chicken. And this might explain why our three critters like to target chickens so much, because they look like one of their common prey items. And of course they do this just so they can survive and feed their families, as you can see here. Well, now that we're done looking at their food chains, let's start thinking how we can prevent these chicken critter confrontations in the first place. People who have chickens, including me, have a variety of methods when it comes to keeping their chickens and critters safe. Some people play offense, others play defense, or a little bit of both. But today we're going to focus a little bit more on the offense side. So for starters, I want you all to think how we can make the chicken coop safer for our chickens and critters. If you thought of anything around the lines of preventing critters from getting in the coop in the first place, you'd be right. Making sure that there's not any holes or small openings is a really good first approach, especially when it comes to the weasel. Because remember, weasels are the smallest land carnivore in North America. They're about 6 inches long, and they can fit in the holes as small as 1 inch in diameter, so about the size as the hole that I'm making with my fingers. That's really small, so making sure that even holes that small aren't in your coop can be challenging sometimes. Now it's time to think outside the box. Or should I say coop? While my rooster here recovers from that amazing joke I just did, I want us to think about our next way about preventing chicken critter confrontations. And that would be with having outdoor fenced areas for our chickens. So how can we make an outdoor fenced area safer for our birds and keeping critters out of trouble? So if you thought of anything around the lines of just making your outdoor fence more secure, you'd be right. Now, unlike my outdoor fenced area, some people have aerial nettings that lie over top of their outdoor pen. Now, what critters could an aerial netting prevent? If you thought of the hawk, you'd be right on the money, but also foxes. Foxes are really good jumpers. They can jump from 3 to 6 feet, and they can even climb fences if they're really determined. So when it comes to foxes, what's another way to prevent them from getting into your outdoor pen? Foxes, they're also really good diggers, and they'll often dig underneath fences to get to your birds, because they're that smart. So what are ways to prevent foxes from digging underneath a fence? What some owners do is that they'll either bury fence underneath their fencing, or they'll put down wide planks that lies underneath the fence to prevent foxes from digging underneath. And of course, that also keeps them out of trouble. Our last scenario is when people let their birds free range, just like I do. Now, free ranging is when the chickens can wander wherever they please with no boundaries or restrictions. Now, of course, this makes it tricky when it comes to keeping those chicken and critter confrontations at bay. So how can we prevent our chickens and critters from confronting each other in a free range scenario? If you thought of anything around the lines of being outside when you have your chickens out, or having a guard dog or animal, like my dog Bella here, that's a really good idea, and it's honestly one of the only methods you can do to keep your birds safe. Now Bella here, she is a guard dog, but she couldn't even hurt a fly. She just really likes to chase things. So now that we've covered some offense ways when it comes to preventing chicken critter confrontations, what's a defense method? Now defense methods, they can get kind of tricky. So I want you to think to yourself for a moment on a defense method on preventing chicken critter confrontations without taking the critter's life. You might have thought of something around the lines of live traps, contacting a DNR officer, or maybe a wildlife control agency. And those three are honestly only your best bets unless you have special permits or license. But this also varies state by state and county by county on what you can actually do when it comes to controlling wild animals. So it's always safest to contact your DNR officer or wildlife agency. But I want to focus on the hawk for a second, because the hawks are a little different. Hawks are protected by law, so you cannot trap them. So especially contact DNR or wildlife control agency when it comes to hawk problems. Now that we've covered ways on how to prevent chicken-critter confrontations, let's recap what we went over today. First, we learned how such an easy target chickens are for wild animals. So why is that? Why are chickens such an easy target for our foxes, weasels, and red-tailed hawks? Well, as we learned, chickens, they can't fly well, and they can't run that fast either. So it makes it really tempting for our three critters to take a bite. And then we dove deeper into each of our critters' food chains, and we looked at the animals within and how energy flows. So, do you remember a common trend between our three critter food chains? Well, as we look back in our food chains, we noticed that all three food chains had a wild bird, and in some sort of way, kind of looks like a chicken. So that might explain why wild animals target chickens so much. And then lastly, we explored ways to prevent chicken-critter confrontations offensively or defensively. Can you remember one of the main and most important reasons when it comes to having a chicken coop? How to keep it safe? Well, the number one way to keep it safe is by preventing any holes or openings, especially because weasels. And why weasels? Remember, weasels, they're really small and they can fit in really tiny holes, even this big. Well, thank you for participating in my lesson today. I hope you learned something new and gain a new perspective as to why a lot of wildlife like to prey on chickens so much. Thank you and have a great day.